Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Bridie.
Good morning, Patrick.
Morning, Bridie.
This week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had a much anticipated phone call with Donald Trump. How did it go?
Well, it came not long after President Trump had dropped the somewhat startling news that there were going to be tariffs on steel and aluminium, and that set the bar for Anthony Albanese to have to try and get some exemption from that for Australia, as Malcolm Turnbull had done with Trump 1.0. And directly after the call, it seemed like it had gone quite well. Trump said that Albanese was a very fine man, a very fine gentleman, something like that. And he said he would give strong consideration to an exemption for Australia. So, you know, in that very narrow framing, it looked like Albanese had done better than he could have. And the opposition had obviously been gearing up to criticise him if he hadn't got at least that far. But obviously it's a way, way more difficult situation than that. We still don't know if we've got that exemption or not. Things were said subsequently that suggested that maybe we wouldn't. The Trade Minister, Don Farrell, is off to Washington as we speak to talk to his counterpart just as soon as he is sworn in, which goes to show how chaotic this all is. So, I think it's a very difficult situation, and this is like the first part of the first act in 4 years of chaos.
Apparently they spoke for around 40 minutes. So you think what we've heard out of that is that Trump would consider an exemption and described Albanese as a very fine man, but what they spoke about for the remaining kind of 38 minutes, you wonder.
And who did most of the talking? I don't know. What do you reckon, Pat?
Yeah. I don't know. But look, the other point I would make is that subsequent to that conversation, Pete Navarro, who's sort of Trump's trade guru, came out and said there were not going to be any exemptions again and doubled down on it. So,
and he was the one that sort of was talking about this gentleman's agreement that seemed to have happened between Morrison and Trump, which Biden then didn't kind of continue on with, that we wouldn't export too much aluminium, and now it wasn't written down. We're being held to something that nobody can quite determine. I mean, that's how chaotic the whole thing is.
And he was particularly critical about the role of Australia in just apparently destroying the US aluminium industry, where we're actually really very small part of this. They're the world's largest importer of aluminium. We make up a small portion of that. So
you're letting facts get in the way of things.
Now, this was Australia's first interaction with the Trump presidency. What do you think we learned from it?
It's, Trump 2.0, here we come. It's a capricious, chaotic, unilateralist administration, and this is the leader of a country who's supposed to be our greatest ally, with whom we supposedly have a free trade agreement. Remember that? We all wrote a whole lot about that. And, he drops this, we're going to have tariffs on steel and aluminium on a plane on the way to the Super Bowl to a couple of reporters with no real sort of prior warning. So, and then, we all have, and this is a situation that every country is going to find itself in. You have to figure out, you're left hanging and wondering, and, what do you have to offer him, and how do you show fealty to him, and what will he do? And he is in the position of complete power in this relationship, and everybody is trying to figure out how to deal with it. Now, at least we're just waiting for a pronouncement on steel and aluminium tariffs. I mean, we're not like Ukraine, where his whim might help decide the outcome of a territorial conflict and war that has cost tens of thousands of lives. We're not Gaza, we're not Greenland, but he's a bully, and he's deliberately rewriting the whole post-war economic and security order, and he's there for 4 years, and he's much better organised this time. And I think every country in the world is trying to work out how to deal with him, and this is our first tiny foray into, welcome to the future.
And I think it shows also how transactional his relationships are. So one of the other few things we heard out of this conversation was that Albanese apparently told him, oh, look, it's fine because we actually buy a lot of aeroplanes from you, and Trump seemed to like that suggestion. And also we have a trade surplus, the US has a trade surplus with us, so we buy more things from the US than we export to them. And this was music to Trump's ears apparently, but it just shows how much the advisors around everybody who's trying to deal with Trump, from the Prime Minister and everyone around him, must be wargaming these things and trying to,
in this chaos, it's capricious. You don't know, there's no rules really.
No.
What do you think the wargaming is that's happening? What do you think the strategy is from our leaders?
Look, I think they're probably learning as they go. They're trying different things out. But one thing we've seen already is that they're going to great pains not to, vocally contradict the president.
Which makes sense, right? You've got a bully, you don't poke him in the eye.
Exactly, yeah. So that's one thing we've seen, even on, the announcement around Gaza. The Prime Minister was, sticking up for the, international law and Australia's position on a two-state solution, but he also reiterated that line, I'm not going to provide running commentary. And the opposition has a kind of version of this as well, where they try not to get dragged into everything that Trump says and comment on it, because they don't want to contradict him, but also they don't want to endorse it. So they're in this kind of difficult position about having to answer questions about things that are actually monumentally important, and then Australia has existing foreign policy on, or trade policy, but they don't want to get dragged into the debate constantly.
But I think that sort of goes to one of the real problems with all of this, which is, yes, you don't want to provide a running commentary because you drive yourself mad and you have to change it every day because he changes what he says every day, and that makes sense, and it's not in our national interest to provoke somebody in that kind of position of power. But I think whomever is in the lodge or in power anywhere in the world is going to have to figure out where their red lines are, because this is an authoritarian leader who is trying to pull down the post-World War II democratic and international order from the inside. And when do we actually have to stand up, and not just in our national interest, which is sort of what, say, Malcolm Turnbull did to get the exemption from steel tariffs last time, but also in the interest of the things that we purportedly believe in, like the international rule of law or like human rights. Like, when is the right time to stand up to him? I think every world leader is grappling with that. I don't know that there is a right answer, but I certainly think there has to be a red line somewhere, given the agenda that we know that he has.
Unfortunately, there's a realpolitik involved here as well. Small countries like Australia and Canada can't actually make that much difference if they want to stand up for things like trade policy. Whereas the response we've seen from the EU has been quite different, where they've said, we're going to retaliate if you
Sure.
put tariffs in. This is a separate issue from obviously sticking up for international law, but there's we can go and ask for changes to tariffs, steel and aluminium tariffs, but we're not in a position to say we're going to put retaliatory tariffs in.
There's bilateral things like, we have to deal with him and get what we need on tariffs. But there are also multilateral things like the International Criminal Court or the Paris Agreement or the World Health Organization
WTO
or the World Trade Organization, all the things that Trump would like to dismantle, which are in the interests of the world. And I feel like ultimately there's going to have to be some sort of multilateral agreement to try to preserve those things against him.
Sure, and even the responses that countries like China and the EU have put in, where the retaliatory tariffs are incredibly damaging for the world economy, and it's not necessarily the right approach. You're much better off in many ways to go to the WTO and try and resolve this.
Well, except Trump doesn't,
No.
doesn't abide by the WTO, wouldn't accept a ruling.
And how does all of this play into our election campaign, which is fast approaching?
Well, I think that's actually quite interesting and potentially kind of dangerous. I mean, it's quite high stakes for Anthony Albanese, because any of these decisions, exemptions, no exemptions, whatever the next thing is, can drop in this very febrile atmosphere in the lead up to the campaign. And, he is battling a perception that the coalition and some voters think that he's weak, and he needs to appear like he's handling this relationship with strength and determination, which I think so far he's handled it right, but it's a danger for him. And like I said, the coalition was setting up that phone call as a bit of a test, and I think that will continue to happen. But I think the idea that it's likely to be all sort of rosy under the coalition is also a bit misguided. And I also think the idea that a future Australian Prime Minister should just cozy up to Trump and, do what he says and agree with him at all times is misguided, because, bullies don't respect people who are weak and subservient. You need to find the right moments to stand up to someone like Trump, as I think Malcolm Turnbull did on tariffs last time. I also think that this whole idea about Kevin Rudd is a little overblown. Like, sure, he criticised him, and I think Kevin Rudd probably wouldn't have the same, as ambassador, wouldn't have the same number of friends or close allies or close confidants in Trump's inner circle. But he will be working this very hard because Kevin Rudd's a diligent kind of guy. And I think I think any leader is going to find that relationship difficult and hard to navigate.
So how do you think the approach so far from Albanese to Trump is sitting with voters?
I think one thing you have to keep in mind is that Trump is not particularly popular amongst Australian voters. If he ran for election in Australia, he would not get elected, basically. The kind of things that he's interested in, attacking DEI, these culture war things, they're not particularly popular with Australian voters. Australian voters are interested in cost of living issues, inflation, mortgages. They are the key issues at the moment for Australian voters. And I think we went slightly to the danger of for the coalition here. And Peter Dutton spoke to the Liberal Party room about this, urging MPs not to spend too much time on these kind of issues that play well in the culture wars and often in the media, but they don't particularly resonate with voters, and there's an opportunity cost. The more that they're talking about these issues, the less they're talking about cost of living and the economy. So I think that Albanese's government's approach is right in trying to dead-bat a lot of these issues and trying to avoid the running commentary, and it's probably in most voters' interest to not get into these things.
But if you look at it in the immediate sense of an election campaign, there are a few dangers for Albanese, I think. One is just the Trump circus, the Trump Daily News, agenda dominates the agenda. And that, what are you going to put at the top of the front page? Trump takes over Greenland, or the Labor Party announces an extra policy on Medicare. It is dominant in the news cycle, and to that extent drowns out some local news. I mean, it's not going to drown out the whole election campaign, but it's competing for attention. And also, if something really goes wrong, or if Trump really sort of says something or does something that makes Anthony Albanese look weak, it's hard to see how that's going to play with voters, but it could turbocharge the coalition's narrative. It's possible that it could play that way, I think. And it's a constant sort of distraction. So I don't think it's irrelevant to our election campaign. I think it's like a danger. Parties want the election campaigns, they want to have a grid and they want to stick to their message through the entire 33 days. And this is just going to be a constant thing that might blow up and divert them off their message. And to that end, I don't think it's a welcome thing for election strategists.
We've already seen a big difference in Trump's second term compared to the first. It's very obvious that they're more disciplined and more organised this time. So how does the media navigate Trump 2.0?
I think that's a really difficult question, and one that we've been sort of grappling with in our own newsroom. When Trump announces something like his plan for Gaza, it's crazy. It's not going to happen. None of the countries in the Middle East are going to accept
However, he's the president of the United States.
He's the president of the United States. So you have to, at one level, take it incredibly seriously. And it obviously has repercussions for people in Gaza and, for people across, the Middle East as well. But at the same time, it's insane. Like, how do you deal with these things?
But and I think it means that there's so many stories, and there's those kind of really out there ones, which we do have to report on. And then there's all the ones that are actually happening, which we need to report on too, and they're harder to get at, like pausing US aid. That's having immediate ramifications across a whole lot of countries, like pausing the transfer of funds to the World Health Organization. I mean, I don't even get it. How do you think that we're going to deal with global outbreaks of diseases, even if you only care about the American population? This is clearly globally significant. Withdrawing from the Paris Agreement,
sanctioning
the ICC.
Yeah.
Like, all of these things are immediately and tangibly important, but there's just not enough minutes in a news broadcast or pages in a newspaper or stories on a news site to deal with them all. And I think the issue for the media is, how do we triage the constant flow, and how do we pick the things that are really going to make a difference? How do we distinguish them from the things that are the travelling circus but maybe won't happen, as you say? And of course, He's also, as predicted, cracking down on the news media in all the ways that were predicted, with legal threats and banning people from press conferences and all the things that we said he would do. So actually also for our colleagues in the United States, delivering the news in this environment where it's more important than ever is getting harder than ever.
So how does that affect the global media in this vital point in history?
I thought that a comment piece we ran by a columnist called Raphael Baer was really interesting in that regard, because he kind of took 3 steps back and he was pointing out that all these arguments that are being made by the people who would defend democracy, who would defend multilateralism, who would defend all the institutions and norms that were set up after World War II when authoritarianism was defeated the last time, those arguments actually aren't really working in lots of places across the world. And, you know, like we've got the bloke who's like the shadow president, Elon Musk, actively working with and encouraging the AfD in Germany. I mean, it's inconceivable to me. Well, it should be inconceivable to us that is happening, but it is happening. It kind of means that the authoritarians are in the house. They're in here, and they have this huge financial power and this huge strategic power. Increasingly, they have control of the global flow of information. And like, I wouldn't want to be in the role of a middling power trying to work out how to deal with that. And as the media under attack from those same forces, it is really hard to work out how to deal with that. But I think we just need to be conscious that this isn't just a normal kind of political fight that is happening here. It's something quite cataclysmic.
And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. What was that for you, Lenore?
Okay, I'm sort of on a theme here, but in the deluge, refer to previous conversation, I missed a story, which was that the owner of Google, Alphabet, has dropped its promise not to use artificial intelligence for the purposes of developing weapons and surveillance tools. They said that they'd updated their ethical guidelines on AI, and they no longer referred to not pursuing technologies that could cause or are likely to cause overall harm. Yeah, so there's that.
It's absolutely wild that we are in a moment of time where a story like that could be buried by other stories.
I missed it.
And Patrick, what can't you get out of your head this week?
I've been following really closely the trial this week and of Sam Kerr, the Matildas striker and Chelsea women's player as well, who was found not guilty for allegedly racially aggravated harassment of a London policeman. And I've been quite shocked that the case itself actually got anywhere near a courtroom, let alone this far. I think, my feelings on it were that this was just a complete abuse of process by police in the UK. I can definitely understand, what was going on with Kerr during this whole process with the police. I think there was a very one-sided case put to the court by police. There was this 11-month gap between one statement and another statement. I just think how it ever got past the Crown Prosecution Service into a courtroom and then past the point of actually, getting a hearing on it. I am absolutely astounded by it. And I think actually, Metropolitan Police having, a pretty patchy reputation for dealing with women at this point should actually take a look at themselves and have a think about why it got to this point.
It does seem staggering, and I actually got a lot out of the full story. I thought that I had read everything on this case over the past couple of weeks, and the latest full story episode on that was very revealing as well. Thanks so much for joining me this week, Lenore.
Thank you, Bridie.
And thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Bridie.